So you built this financial informer bot. What does it do?
This is the one that it'll take scheduled events and it'll at that time every day it'll tell you the upcoming economic events from Market Watch. It lists those out, which is really useful if you trade and things like that because when those events happen, it's super high volatility, and so it's good to know when that's going to happen. And then simultaneously, it'll send you. I think I have it the three most interesting news articles based on your interests, which that database holds, like tickers that you're interested in.
So, for example, every morning at 9, I can receive in my Discord or
Yep.
whatever the latest financial news.
You could get the upcoming economic events for the week or 2 weeks, and then you can get any news that came out. And maybe I think actually why this one is popular at all because it doesn't do anything that other bots don't, but the personality on it, I made it conspiratorial, and I think that it's actually kind of interesting because when you're talking to it, it thinks that everything is rigged, and which it kind of is.
Can you give me an example of like how it's conspiracy?
It's like he's like sarcastic, but he's just saying Google's grand Canadian standoff is akin to watching a high stakes poker game where the stakes are the very essence of online news consumption.
So it makes news interesting, not
Exactly.
listing out the dry facts.
You're not just like listening to a robot.
I like how you're blending character
Yeah.
bots with the productivity bots into one bot that's both can improve your productivity, but is also has a fun character.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I realized how important that was with this one because it's boring. News is not always. It's interesting to have bias.
So I think the reason your news bot stands out from a lot of the other AI news bot is one, it's more fun, it has a personality, and two, you actually use workflow to streamline the output, so it's in a more predictable structure.
Exactly. Well, this is this is a super useful one. Getting the current date and time again doesn't need an input, but super useful when you need to have awareness of what time it is right now. And basically, it's just a simple function to return the date and time. But the more interesting one, I would say, is I think this one. One thing that's really awesome also about this is things will run in parallel. Sometimes that's a pain when you're coding, when you're dealing with asynchronous functions. And so this really very simply and visually you can take an input, and in this case it's just a search query, and this one is going to run 3 different functions simultaneously, and they're all news aggregating related, and then it'll then send that data to 3 LLM modules that I have, and on those modules I'm using the basic GPT because it's faster in response time, and I'm giving it article. So the first step, taking a search query. Second step in this one is this get news plugin, which I think might be also built in, and that's outputting this array of articles. And then I'm taking those articles, which is the input right here, and I'm using an LLM module or node to organize those in a user-friendly format. And it's basically just stripping out all the extra stuff that it doesn't need for the end user.
So are you having the LLM summarize those articles?
I'm actually not, but I'm just having it organize them into a nice list textually. And then it's doing a couple things. So one of them is it's going to this website, and this one is actually static. This isn't using the input of the search query, but it's running in parallel because it has events, right? And so another cool thing of Coze is you can program the bot to run workflows or any prompt at a given time of the day, and the user can control that and edit it. And so that's what this whole thing is, a workflow that it runs on a scheduled basis. And one of the parts of that workflow is this static thing where it checks Market Watch, checks the calendar of economic events, and it takes those events and, I tell it to assemble it in a format that I wanted to see that was the most legible and useful to what I wanted to use it for. I'm just using it to gather this event data, gather news from two different sources, which is important for me because it's a daily event. It started to repeat news items and I was getting annoyed at that. So I just wanted to give it more data to use. I told it to not repeat things based on the history of the conversation. And so once all three of those run, obviously it has to wait. It awaits all three to be completed before it actually finishes. Even though it has to wait for the weakest link, it's still running all three in parallel. So it ends up being much faster than running three in sequentially, right? And then I just take those outputs and I feed that back into the bot here. And that goes off every day at whatever time you want.
So for the workflow, you use 3 separate plugins, right?
It was 3. One is a browse that just goes to a static URL to get the dynamic content on it. The second, and then the other 2 are just 2 different news feeds that use the search query that it was given.
So why do we need 3 instead of just one single workflow?
Like one running sequentially. Yeah. You don't need it, but I have found it's much faster to run all 3 in parallel because basically it makes those 3 requests simultaneously, and then you're still waiting out on the slowest one, obviously, for the thing to finish, but because you're running, you're triggering all 3 at once.
So because we already have a Get News plugin, so how is using the workflow to get news different from just using a plugin to get the news? How is the results better?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe I did this because I wanted more control over it. So, and I think it was a function of maybe the bot repeating news stories and things like that. The whole purpose of this whole flow to have more control over how many articles it gets. You can control the top K, and you can control how many articles it actually returns. And then I think I also maybe wanted some control over the formatting at the time or something.
The workflow helps you to produce a more predictable and structured output.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And I would say the other thing is that I'm always trying to give the bot less to deal with at one time so it doesn't get overwhelmed or confused or whatever. And the plugins, if you just look at them as how much text the bot's being given through them, it's being given the title, the description, all the endpoints, all the endpoint descriptions, all that data, as opposed to a workflow, which is really just giving it, again, you could argue it's probably comparable, but I like to make the workflows simpler than the plugins so that it can then determine if a workflow is appropriate, as opposed to like getting all the plugin information, trying to decipher all that and then decide if that's appropriate, which is why it's so useful to have the plugins available in the workflow. So this one, if I ask it, what are the major economic events? This one should run this workflow, which is getting the current time. And the reason it's doing that is to gain an understanding of what day it is so that it can then make the schedule of economic events coming up. One thing I did run into is it always gives UTC time, which can be a problem. And unfortunately, I haven't found a great way to, other than asking the user to get their locale.
So without you programming this workflow, the large language model wouldn't know what time and date it is.
Yeah, I mean, unless something's changed recently, that's always kind of been a problem. And it's such a stupid, simple thing, but for whatever reason, unless of course it has internet access. So if you give it a search capability or internet capabilities, obviously it can figure that out. That's like another plugin. So it's nice to have just a simple, really quick workflow that it knows if it needs the time. It would usually list all the events. There's another one that will get the financial news, which is that same workflow.
And I noticed you have a database as well.
I've played a bit with deciding whether variables or for certain purposes, variables are better, for certain ones, databases are better. And I think this is actually a decent example of which one works better for 2 different things. So the time zone, if the bot is able to get that data from the user at some point, it'll store it in the variable. And then for the database, this one it keeps, so when you first start using it, it'll try to acquire your interests, your news interests, or your tickers that you're interested in, things like that. So then it will then, when it gives you this news aggregation, it'll use those in the search query for the workflow.
So basically, the variable in database allow the bot to give more personalized
Yeah.
answers.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.